as you get further and further down into fiat money, you're less able to control basically what you're allowed to do. Because as a home builder, for example, I have investors, or I need to judge or value how I spend my time building your home. So if I'm building, let's say like $1 million home, and as the builder, let's say I have to make like $100,000 out of that million in order for me to do all that work, for it to be worth my time, because of all of the difficulty that goes into building a home, let's say, like I have to be able to make $100,000. If you want a home and I want to build it for you, your budget is really $900,000 to actually get all of the physical material and the people on site to go through all of the processes to get everything approved. So if your money loses purchasing power, if we use the same numbers, instead of 900,000, maybe now it's only 800,000. So you've lost $100,000 in purchasing power. Okay. Now, if we do this over a long period of time, your $1 million house really only has like $300,000 worth of material in it. 75 years ago, we made some choices, and we've allowed those choices to continue to compound. But now we are the generation, or the group, that are stuck with fixing the problem. My overarching opinion is that you have to basically remove the store of value component from homes, so that people aren't willing to fight tooth and nail for X, Y, or Z, whatever it is, to prevent their equity from falling. And then to me, that unwinds a lot of the other problems, because then a home is no different than a car, right? You buy it, you use it, it falls apart, you replace parts. And then eventually, if you don't take care of it, you got to get rid of it. Or if you take care of it for a long time, it'll last a long time.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Think Bitcoin podcast, where I talk to Bitcoiners about big ideas, art, philosophy, the humanities. If you've been enjoying the show, please take a second to like the show wherever you're listening, to rate the show, and of course, to subscribe to the show as well. It really does make a difference. Today's guest is Kelly Lannan. Kelly is a home builder and a developer. He's also the author of the Bitcoin Urbanism Substack, which you guys should all check out. We talk about what's wrong with the built environment today, why housing is inferior in both materials and aesthetics today, why we can't and don't make beautiful things anymore, the various ways in which fiat is upstream of all of these problems and issues. And we also talk about what we can do to fix it. So without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Kelly Lannan. All right, we are live. Kelly Lannan, welcome to the Think Bitcoin podcast. Very excited to have you here today.
Well, thank you, Logan. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here as well.
So, Kelly, you've been, writing and talking about what you call the built environment, especially vis-a-vis Bitcoin and vis-a-vis sound money, and fiat money, how the monetary order affects how we build things, the things that we live in, the cities that we live in, stuff like that. And you've been writing about that for a while, I want to get into all of that. I think it's really important, and it's just something that a lot of people don't think about. But before we do, I do want to do a little bit of intro for folks who may or may not be familiar with you and your background. Can you just tell folks a little bit about your background, about your Bitcoin journey, how you got into all this, and what you're doing now?
Yeah. So I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. My dad was a home builder, since before I was born. So I was born into the residential construction life. I guess I always tell people that I never got grounded. I just got sent to the job site. So I spent a lot of time digging ditches or filling holes or doing all of the jobs that all of the laborers got to do, except it was the boss's kid. So I was that guy on a job site when I got in trouble. But I pretty much stuck with it ever since then, going on 25-ish years. So I've been, through my dad's office, involved in just about every aspect of residential real estate. So you would call us like a vertically integrated firm. So we go and we find the land through brokers, and then we buy it. And then in that process, we get all of the entitlements. So we hire the architect, the civil engineer, the zoning attorneys, all of the people that you need to put together basically like a zoning case or construction documents for homes, all of these other things. So then once we get approval from typically the city or the zoning board or whoever it is, we'll buy the land, we'll close, and then we'll start the construction process. So we also own a general contracting firm, and we do what's called self-performing. So we hire all of the subcontractors, the concrete guys, framers, drywall, cabinets, countertops, paint, all of the subs that are required to build a home, and then we manage that process up until the point it's either rented, and then we sell like a whole project. Let's say it's less than 50 apartments or something like that, or if they're homes, then we list them for sale and sell them and move on. So I've been essentially a merchant builder my whole life, and that's kind of how I got in my professional career, doing all of that. I've always enjoyed, building things. I like the process, even though it's definitely changed since I started about 15 years ago full time. So from there, how I got into the Bitcoin journey was, I guess I'd always been kind of a gold bug, not like a crazy gold bug. I subscribed to the Mises Institute. Gosh, when I was in probably early college, I learned about Austrian economics. So I'd always kind of been in that vein. And when Bitcoin came along, I did the cryptocurrency. Everything's better than Bitcoin, and there's always something new coming around the bend, right? So
Naturally.
I jumped in on that trend. I think, oh, it feels like it's been so long now, but I think it was like 2015, 2016, and then wrote it up, wrote it all the way back down, did like what everybody else did, lost a bunch of money on crypto. And then that was about the time when I started focusing more on Bitcoin. I found the Nakamoto Institute. I found those guys, read all that stuff. And then by the time I got done with that, that was when Saifedean published Bitcoin Standard. So I went up to Sedona for my birthday around the 4th of July, and I sat with my feet in a creek and I basically devoured the book in like 3 days, which is, for those of you who have read it, it's basically insane because it's just a wall of text explaining why, you know, uh, Bitcoin is the greatest hard money, along with, I guess you could say, some of the secondary effects, which we'll kind of talk about today as far as real estate, architecture, and all that goes. But I would say from that point on, I was pretty much a toxic maxi. I guess now we're called monetary maximus or whatever. I don't really pay attention too much to that stuff on Twitter anymore. But yeah, that was kind of my turning point. And then I joined a group a little bit later called the International Blockchain Real Estate Association, which was about, or maybe that was before. I'm not quite sure, but it was about trying to transfer real estate title using public blockchains, not explicitly Bitcoin, but it focused on Bitcoin because it was the only public blockchain, right? So there was a test case, I think it was in Cook County of all places, where they tried to figure out if we record a deed for transferring title, uh, would the jurisdictional powers that be recognize it as a valid transfer of title? So for most people who don't understand, when you buy or sell real estate, we have a county system. So the state isn't the one who tells you who owns the land, right? You record your deed, your transfer deed, through the local county. So there's a county recorder's office. You take it in there, or at least you used to take it in there. That's how long I've been doing it. And you sit there, then they record it, they put a sticker on it, and they give it back to you. Nowadays, a lot of times it's just electronic, or your title company will do that. So, anyways, they recorded one, and then they basically found out, they're like, no, this isn't going to work. We're not going to accept it, because they had to make, if I'm not mistaken, it was basically formatting changes. So I think when they recorded it on the blockchain, it was using color coins, which was a semi-new thing at the time, in order to record the data, and then it just didn't work. So after the bust in 2017, that kind of fell through, and I just kind of stuck with Bitcoin. And while I was at a conference for the same organization, it was in Midtown Manhattan. I stayed in the West Village with a family friend for a little over a week. I just went in advance because I had never been there as an adult. I went there as a kid, but we did the Home Alone tour, I guess you could call it. but I was too young to even recognize what was going on or where it was. So I went back as an adult, and the West Village is one of the famous places because of Jane Jacobs and all the things that she did to preserve the area way back in the day. And I was just completely blown away by what I saw. Seeing pictures of all of these places is one thing, but then like walking those streets and realizing like how wide a 12 or 14 foot wide street in the West Village is, with whatever a 6 or 8 foot sidewalk to another building or whatever it is, like it's completely different. And growing up in Phoenix, there's like 300-year-old buildings here, if they're 100-year-olds, and they're still standing. There's like three of them. But it's like when you're in the West Village, which buildings aren't 100 years old is really,
Right.
you kind of have to ask yourself. So that was when I really got into strong towns, and I found that blog, and Chuck Marone has a book by the same name now. And I was kind of like, how did I live in a place where it's not even close to looking like what the West Village does? Like, I get that, it's Manhattan and it's been there for, 500 years or whatever. But what, like, why is my town different? Why is everything so different? Strong towns helped a lot with that. And then the Bitcoin aspect of it with sound money was really what like did it for me. So that was when I started asking questions like, how did all this happen? Like, I understand the gold standard stopped, in 1930, whatever, 34, 33. But, people still kept building this way in other places, but not where I live. So that was kind of when I started exploring, like, how much has really changed. So, Arizona was incorporated as a state in 1912. The city I live in was incorporated as a city in 1951. So, I started looking at like, well, what happened around like basically between the 30s and the 50s. And that's when you get into FDR and the New Deal and a lot of the planning decisions that were made kind of like at a Supreme Court level and all this other stuff right around that area. So that's what it started my writing adventure, into questioning kind of like what's going on and why do we have to live this way, and why do we live this way, and why are things the way they are. So with those questions, and then my involvement generally with construction, like, I get to see how the sausage is made, and I've been lucky that over the course of my life, basically since I guess the late 90s when I got grounded and sent to job sites all the way up until now, like the last 30 or so years, I've been able to literally watch the decline in various aspects of construction that occur for various reasons. So, it kind of gave me a different catbird seat, if you will, about what's going on. And I decided to start writing about it. And I haven't written in a while, but I need to. I have a bunch of, the writer's joke is that there's always more draft posts than there are posts, and I also too suffer from that. But yeah, no. So that's my background. That's how I got to where I am, and how I got to writing Bitcoin Urbanism and talking to people such as yourself.
Awesome. Yeah. And I would, for folks who have not, and if you have not been around for a full cycle, you maybe don't know Bitcoin Urbanism, Kelly's Substack. The articles in there are kind of evergreen. I was just rereading some of them relatively recently. It's extremely interesting stuff. Highly recommend folks check it out. Kelly, obviously, we need you to keep writing. But I am intimately familiar with the problem of having more drafts than you know what to do with, and just kind of being scattered. I have a similar situation going on myself, but yeah, you provided such a great jumping off point for where I want to go. With the conversation with the West Village and your experience there, and kind of how like revelatory that was for you, like a revelation, seeing that. Because I think anybody who's been in the West Village has kind of a similar. I'm from a very small town in Pennsylvania, and the nearest city to me is like 3 hours away. I went to New York for the first time probably when I was like in maybe 18, maybe. I was there for a hot sec, and then didn't really spend any meaningful time in New York until well after college. So, and even for me, I mean, just, walking into the West Village for the first time, I had a very similar experience where I was like, this is beautiful. This is just a whole different vibe really than what I'm used to growing up in. And I think people feel the same way when they look at European cities. I mean, I think we think of if you travel in Europe and you're in Prague or something like that, or parts of Paris. I mean, I don't know why Prague is the example that comes to mind for me right away, but if you're in like Bruges or something like that, it's just I think people look at that and they think, wow, that everybody acknowledges that that is what a beautiful city looks like. And I think everybody who has experienced that has this feeling, well, why the hell how did we get where we are now? And I think most recently, I don't know if you've seen the show, my wife and I watched The Gilded Age, um, which takes place in Manhattan during the Gilded Age on HBO. And one of the reasons I like it so much is just the visual of the city, the way that it's laid out, the streets, the attention to detail with like every sort of piece of craftsmanship on the home, outside and inside, and it's stark in its juxtaposition to where we are now. Where we kind of all live in some version of sprawl. But so I want to just you've done a lot of homework on this. How I don't want to give you too huge of a question, but let's just start with, how did what are the beginning sort of things that or events and things that transpired that started this snowball of taking us away from this world? How did we get here?
Um, honestly, I think if I remember back to my college days, I took like an architectural history class, and at least the easiest way to compare and start. So you brought up European cities, which is like everybody loves that, right? So the difference between like a European city and how they're laid out and how, Manhattan, if we stick with the example, is that like in Europe, there was always basically warring tribes, right? Until we have like the nation states that we have today. Like even if you rewind like 125 years ago before World War One, like the quantity, I guess probably like before the Ottoman, not the Ottoman, Otto von Bismarck, before he united basically what is Deutschland today. Um, like the amount of principalities and stuff around Europe was like there were like thousands of them, right? So each city was built not only just as a city, but also as a defensive layer. So they had all the walls, and you had to basically fit what you could within what you could afford to defend. Um, so a lot of times people inflate, well, that's how a European city is just laid out because that's how they had to defend themselves. Like they had to basically jam everything they could inside of a wall that they could build and defend. So to some degree, that's true. But European cities also have a lot of pragmatic building approaches. A lot of it goes, all the way back to the Romans, Vitruvius, um, the book on architecture, which is great, by the way. Um, and that kind of goes even further back to, well, the Greeks basically tried to idealize what buildings would be, and they use all the proportions of man in order to do it. So the average Greek at the time was like 5'7". So the proportions of buildings are all based on that proportion, right? Or it's like this, the various proportions of all buildings, like all the elements, all of these different things are based on a 5'7" tall man. Okay. So now we flash forward to New York City. We basically don't have, there's no other principalities that are attacking, right? So then they have the freedom to decide, like, if we are going to lay out a city, how would we do it if we weren't, worried about our neighbor from 100 miles away coming in trying to take it over. And that's where you get a lot of the grid that we have today, as well as the size of the lot. So a lot of people never really think about like the size of a lot being, I guess, germane, but the average width of a lot of the lots in New York City are like usually between 20 and 30 feet. Now, why is that? Now that is because it is the average attention span of a human is about 7 seconds. So when you are able to walk by a building or like a storefront or something like that, you are only paying attention for about 7 seconds. So that's all they have. So that's somewhere between 20 and 30 feet, depending on your stride. And um, a lot of plots started narrowing down to those sizes. So if you had a big farm in Manhattan, right, eventually you parceled it up and you divvied it out, and they started all being about that width. So
Hmm.
when we talk about like what happens like going forward and where it all change, it's an interesting inflection from what I'm talking about, because a lot of the way that things were designed and built was just around the human proportion, their ability to pay attention, and then other like behavioral aspects, right? So I approach a lot of the stuff that I write about from like an evolutionary perspective, whether it's evolutionary biology or psychology. A lot of the things that like the behaviors that humans adopted over time in an environment without buildings, right? Because you're in a tribal deal, you're a nomad or whatever it is, and then a lot of that starts changing during the farming, um, or the agricultural revolution, rather. So people were using and designing things based off of how humans were, and then what happens is when we get into the early 20th century, it's a lot of, well, it's not so much about how humans are. It's about what we want or what I think should be done. So the
Hmm.
earliest case, to answer your question, is I think it is like 1906 when New York City was trying to regulate the height and setback of buildings in order to allow what they determined to be like enough light to penetrate to the street, right? So at that point, buildings had started getting so tall because steel is now being used for buildings, right? Probably at that point, it's been used for maybe 20 years. So they're getting pretty good at constructing buildings with steel. Then you also have the elevator, which is really what allowed buildings to go more than like 7 or 8 stories, because otherwise you had to walk up them, right? And so once your physical constraints for what humans can do or how they move around start basically disappearing, it opens up other options as far as like construction goes. So if that opens up options as far as construction goes, people are doing things that have really never been done before. And then how does everybody else feel about it is kind of a good way to phrase it. Well, so if you're building a building that's now 100 stories tall, and you just cut off light in somebody's garden and all their plants die, like that's a new problem that has to be addressed, right? So New York City was probably one of the first cities to really start going after what we would call property rights in that regard, and trying to curb them to the benefit of people that are being affected by it. So like the gardener that no longer has, enough light to grow a garden because of the 100-story building. Okay. So now take that concept and just start, incrementally increasing the potential, problem, was a problem cause solution conundrum, right? So by the time that you get to the 1920s, you start having zoning restrictions for kind of like the civil rights stuff, race, creed, religion, all of these other things, because people wanted to separate single family homes from everything else. So, what that did is that it allowed a subdivision of that principle, separating the basic uses of industrial, commercial, and residential into, well, we can break this down even further between all three to control even more different outcomes, right? Whether there were there's another famous case about a laundromat in New York City using chemicals where they had a window open and then the chemicals were ruining a shirt on a clothesline across the street, but literally just across the street, right? So there were cases about, how do we deal with this if somebody's in a city and they're producing um, we'll just call it pollution for simple, not like, the world ending pollution. It's just a pollutant to the air that is now
Hmm.
acting like your neighbor, ruining their shirt while they're trying to dry it. So these problems start cropping up. So how do they control that? Well, if zoning's around, then you can start limiting uses of property to prevent, these unwanted effects, right? Because no one's going to come out and defend the laundromat when they can come out and defend Granny who's trying to dry her clothes and they'll get ruined, right? That's as far as like a pragmatic, political stance, like that's just not, it's just not defendable. Like you're
Right.
not have a good time. And I think that's one of the reasons why private property rights in general have receded over the last 100 years to these kinds of things, because it's really hard to defend that. You can defend it really well from like a legalistic perspective. We'll say untried cases that are slam dunks that don't get tried because there's really no political will. There's more political will to stop them than there are to allow them to happen, even though they may be legalistically right. So like in the state of Arizona where I live, there's a famous case. There's a mountain nearby, the McDowell Mountain, and a family owned literally all of the land. It's thousands of acres, all of the land up to the front of the mountains, basically along the ridge of the peak. And they wanted to develop into what turned out to be like a very nice neighborhood, and the city tried to stop them. So they got all the way to the Supreme Court, where they were basically on the cusp of losing, where the city offered to give them basically carte blanche, whatever you want, but please just stop this so that we can maintain the ability to zone and control land and do all of these other things. So that's kind of how we got to where we are today. It wasn't like an instantaneous, like, well, we're just going to limit this area to single family homes, right? It started out with, I don't want my house to be next to a steel mill, even though that they can build a steel mill right there. And I've been there for 20 years. I just don't want. And then there's all the other, there's lots of talk on Twitter usually about how um, zoning started out as like a racist application, which I understand. I understand that line of thinking, but also at the same time, you were allowed to deed restrict property for all of those reasons anyways. That later got struck down by the Supreme Court. I think it was sometime in the 40s. But the real case that allowed the most rapid expansion of all of this is it's Ambler Realty versus Euclid, Ohio. And that's what the Supreme Court pretty much ignored the lower court's ruling, which was, kind of a by the book property rights deal into, the cities or local jurisdictions basically have the power to limit the use of land for public health and services. And, the magic three words, it's like policing, health, safety, and something else. So from there, that's where a lot of the stuff kind of exploded. And then you have all of the court cases over time that allow cities to do different things. Usually everything gets everything gets ruled in favor of the local jurisdictions because of how broad the Supreme Court case was. And you kind of just keep going and going until somebody tries to stop you. There's been plenty of cases, at least in Arizona, where municipalities get stopped or the statutes get changed about what they can and can't do. But that's kind of the story from here to there, or from there to here, rather. It was kind of like death by 1,000 cuts,
Yeah.
as opposed to, sweeping changes, every 5 years or so.
It
And
sounds like
then,
one of those things where I think you wrote about this in one of your posts on Bitcoin Urbanism, where it's just like, you give, I guess, an administrative philosophy an inch, and it takes sort of miles, plural.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and continues to just these sort of micro concessions on property rights compounded over decades and over decades.
correct.
It's interesting though here. It's interesting hearing you talk about, I'm thinking about another one of your posts where it might have been either you or Strong Towns talking about how the suburban experiment is
Mhm.
really relatively, it's so new,
Yeah.
and really is totally an experiment, and is kind of stands, is sort of completely different from what you were describing about the history of building cities, where it's very human scaled and Vitruvius, and it seems like it was where we are building up these best practices based on humans and human biology and human scale, and we kind of have a whole, we have centuries of proof that this way of organizing ourselves kind of works, versus you get into, I guess, kind of mid 20th century, and you start getting the central planning, and now we just get this big experiment. I guess, is that fair to say? And then I think a lot about, I guess, the maybe downstream effects of that experiment too. There's just a lot of it seems like unpredicted knock-on effects of how we relate to each other once we take ourselves out of this way of living together that we've done for so long, which seems more natural and human, and we move into these ways of living together that are just siloed and isolated and less human. And I also do want to ask you a sub follow-up question because I'm sure some people would respond and say, well, gee, Logan, it sounds like you're arguing that we should all live in these densely populated cities, but, we see the densely populated cities now and people often say, I don't want to live in downtown. I mean, I have lived in downtown Chicago before, and look, there are some downsides to living in downtown Chicago. No disrespect to Chicago, but like people will say, I don't want to live in that because it's unsafe. I don't want to ride public transit because people get killed in public transit. There are crazy people walking around. So that I feel like is maybe a somebody would raise that and say, I actually don't want that. I like my siloed life. And so I'm curious what your response to that. I'm sure you've heard that criticism 1,000 times yourself too.
Yeah, so I'll answer kind of all of the questions at once because they're all related. So the easiest way to think about it from the strong towns perspective is that the density of an area as far as people goes was always commensurate with the infrastructure that was there. Okay, so a good example is like a quaint English village. Okay, so everybody, the thing about like 100 years ago, like Peaky Blinders is actually a good example of this for some of the stuff that, most of the stuff takes place in cities, but the stuff that takes place out of cities, if you look, the infrastructure that is there is always commensurate with the density. Okay, what I mean by that is that if you have a cottage out in the English countryside, you are not taking a freeway to a mile away from the house and getting on an off ramp to a 6-lane road that eventually gets down to a 2-lane residential street. It's like, no. At some point, when you get far enough away from whatever town you're in, everything turns into a dirt road. Okay. And it's not a dirt road that was built for 2 people to go by. It's a dirt road for 1 wagon, right? Or 1 car. And then as far as everything's going, there's no electricity. There's no, sewer services, water services, all of these other things that would be commensurate with what we would think of as like a single family home subdivision today, right? So when you have lower density, you have fewer services. And that's because the lower density can't provide the financial support in order for all of those services to exist. Okay. So that's different than how we view it today because everything is so heavily subsidized from basically the federal government down that when you pay your property taxes or your city services or the liens and all the special assessments and stuff they do, to replace your water and sewer line, none of that can really be afforded without having debt. And when you have from the US perspective, the world reserve currency, you're able to export all of the inflation. You're able to basically accumulate a bunch of debt and you're able to do things with that money. So one of the things that they chose to do basically starting in the 40s after World War II was the suburban experiment. Now it started as strong towns and Chuck successfully point out, it started in Detroit because that's where cars were being made. You had the mobility to drive to a suburban, home subdivision and then drive into the city. And that was in the 20s. Um, but the Detroit experiment at the time is what failed. Like they failed by the time the early 30s of the Depression had come around. Like it was completely obvious that it was a totally, totally bad idea. Like it just doesn't work. So what they were trying to do was use an old, thousands of year old development pattern for cities and apply it to just homes, 10 miles away. And then they learned it doesn't work because um, as far as like construction and stuff goes, like paving and building a street is very expensive. Like it's actually really expensive. People don't understand that, especially when you get into like highways and stuff today. So when, there's always some headline where it's going to cost like $1 billion. Or actually, a good example, the Francis Scott Key Bridge. I think they just announced the cost was going to be like $2 billion to build
Mm.
a bridge that was built, whatever 100 years ago for a fraction of the price. And it's like, yeah, that's That's life today. And then when you're building freeways, you have to remember you're driving at 70 miles an hour, and the goal is to have a completely flat surface, right? So the amount of work that it takes for heavy civil contractors to basically dig up the dirt beneath and then recompact it so high so that when you drive, either a sports car over it or a motorcycle, which is relatively light, to an 18-wheeler, like you do not want the compaction of the road to change. Like everybody's seen one of those things where they drive up to a stoplight and there's like a little divot like in front of the line where you're supposed to stop for the light, right? So a lot of times that's either the friction moving the like literally just peeling the asphalt back,
Hmm.
or it's trucks that stop there and they have to sit there because the length of the red light is so long that the truck literally just starts compacting the dirt down below it. So now you have this little divot. So a lot of times, you know, if you apply that to an area of road where it's not well compacted, like people have seen this, like if you live in a rural place, like you've driven over an area where you know that there's like a little dip, right? And that dip,
Absolutely.
the dip is because it wasn't compacted properly or they didn't go down far enough. Like basically you have to auger, you dig a hole, usually for geotechnical reports, which is, we call it a soils report. It's like 15 or 20 feet. It may vary in different states, but you try to figure out what the soil is and how it's composed that far down so that you can build properly. So like your house doesn't move, right? Because believe it or not, dirt moves. Um, so the street is a good example where it's like, why is it so expensive? It's like, well, because I have to dig down 20 feet to find out what's going on. And then if I have to dig up 5 of that feet and then redo all of it, you know, big yellow tractors, Caterpillars are very, very, very expensive, either to own or to rent or whatever it is. Like they're just expensive. It's big, heavy machinery. It does the work of 1,000 men, but it still costs 500 men to use it. So it's not cheap. But if you use that kind of notion where it's like, okay, all of this stuff is really expensive to do. All of these services are really expensive to provide. But the single family subdivision does not generate enough revenue to replace that road after 30 years because it has to be replaced. We live in an entropic world. Things fall apart over time because they get used. And that's literally just life. That's just how it goes. So, that applies to your water lines, your sewer lines, your home, your roof. Everybody replaces their roof all the time. So that's a good example. Think of, apply that to like your house. Eventually, like the plaster of your drywall on your house has to be replaced. The flooring has to be replaced, your countertops, all of these things just fall apart. So who pays for that? Who pays for that when that happens, and how often does it have to happen? So if we wind back to the single family, subdivision or the cottage, and we want to crank up the intensity, right? So when we get to a place like New York, we'll use the Empire State Building, right? The Empire State Building probably generates billions and billions of dollars worth of tax revenue for the city. Okay. So the idea is that all of the services that exist in front of the Empire State Building, from the subways to all of the infrastructure that goes 50 feet below the building, has to be paid for and replaced and maintained and all of these other things. So is it a financially productive use of the real estate? Now, for the Empire State Building and everything around it, you could say yes. But if you had all the same services in your English village, out in the countryside in Pennsylvania for your 2,000 square foot house, could you say the same? And the answer is clearly not. So, strong towns was really important in my developing, I guess, in developing my understanding of financial productivity. And then if you layer on the Bitcoin aspect of hard money and the fact that we live in a fiat credit world, one of these is possible today, but it's only with our ability to print money, right? Even if it's at, the rate, if we use M2, which is, I think, like over the last, 70 years, it's like 7%, maybe 6 or 7%.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think so.
if we take out, if we ignore COVID's, like whatever that was, like 30%, and we just stick with whatever the historical average is, I think it's around 7%. So even with that, that was what had to happen in order for the city and the subdivisions and all of the places that we live today to exist the way they are. So the problem that Strong Towns addresses, extended from financial productivity, is if we have to replace all this stuff every 30 years and it doesn't pay for itself over the 30-year period, and we are now quite literally 75 years into this, we're basically, 2.5 times through the cycle. By the time we get to the third cycle, at least in the Strong Towns math, is that it's so financially unproductive, it almost costs what everything cost before it combined, right?
Mm,
So you get to a point where, like, in 15 years, if we have to replace all the infrastructure for every single family subdivision in the country, like, it literally can't be afforded. It's probably more than all the debt that we have as that the federal government has combined, right? So, and does the wealth exist with homeowners in order to do that? And the answer is, like, clearly not. Like, a lot of
yeah.
times, a lot of times cities get sued when they send out their special assessments to change out a sewer line in the street. And then the homeowner is responsible from the property line to the home. So for a little bit deeper of a dive for people who don't understand, a lot of times they think the property of their home just ends basically like at the back of the sidewalk, which isn't really true. Okay. There's what's called an easement there. So the easement may be 10, 15, 20 feet, wide, and that's where your actual property line may end. So the city only pulls it up to the property line, and then they tell you, like, you need to hire X, Y, or Z services in order to bring the sewer line from your house out to the end of your property. And that's where a lot of people get in trouble, because then they find out it costs like $30,000 to replace their sewer line from their house to the street, which they thought that the city was responsible for. Right. So a lot of this just goes to say is that we're getting to a point now where all of these things from 40, 50 years ago definitely absolutely have to be replaced. And it's falling onto the private property owners or the homeowners in order to do that. Um, so to kind of tie in what we've said so far, imagine that we have this administrative apparatus for zoning and controlling how land is used, right? But also how it's planned and developed and constructed. Then you layer on all of the complexities of, we built all of these places that could never be afforded, and they're now basically breaking, right? So the Flint, Michigan water pipe deal was one of the prime examples that Strong Towns had used for a while, basically saying, like, listen, like, this is obviously an extreme case of what could happen, but this case in a mild manner is happening literally everywhere across the country. So even if it's like 100th the problem, it's still a problem. And it's so widespread and occurs so often that we need to address basically the elephant in the room. And that's 75 years ago, we made some choices, and we've allowed those choices to continue to compound. But now we are the generation, or the group, that are stuck with fixing the problem. So,
Yeah, I think this is one of the most fascinating, I guess, like frames and perspectives. I think it's just incredibly under discussed. It's a little bit mind blowing, actually.
yeah.
How you were describing the just a mismatch, the disequilibrium between, I guess, like the wealth that exists, versus like the services that have to be sort of maintained, and are being provided, that we live in a built environment that has entirely outpaced our ability to pay for it. That we kind of live in a total fantasy world that just has to be sustained, which is increasingly, I mean, it's like you said, it's impossible to sustain now. Um, I truly do not think that people talk about this. People talk about sound money all the time, obviously on Bitcoin Twitter and its effects on various things. But I'm wondering if is it, do you think it's because this stuff gets a little complex? You got to kind of, I mean, you obviously have so much knowledge and insider knowledge of how all of this works. And you've also done a ton of research by yourself, but like the average person is just, I mean, for me, I think the average person, I'll say it's like as a homeowner too, and the average person is woefully underinformed, I think, on how these services in their counties and their localities work, how they're paid for. how it's all kind of connected to debt as money versus money as money.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't know if that's kind of the block that people are not seeing this, but I mean, you're describing all this to me, and my head's like my brain's like exploding. And I'm just like, whoa, that's kind of an idea that is just I don't think as out there as it should be. Maybe because it's sort of horrifying, and I
Yeah.
don't know if there's a solution. My next question is going to be like, what what do you think we do about that? Is there a path out of the problem that is like plausible and maybe I'm sure Bitcoin is involved, but something other than just well, Bitcoin fixes this. You know, great, we're done here. How do we navigate away from this? Is there any progress being made to sort of say, hey, we need to reevaluate this, or we're going to have a major infrastructural problem?
I think from multiple angles, yes. So to kind of point out like why doesn't the problem get brought up more often? Okay. So because it's a local jurisdictional issue, it's really hard to bring up like I guess like a national fervor about it because every city does things differently because they either are allowed to or well basically because they fought to be allowed to do it a certain way. Right. So a good example is that in the town I live in, we had a vacant property where we ripped up all of the existing surfaces, all the water lines and sewer lines, all the way up to the end of the property in our street, and we got in a fight with the city because they said even though we had disconnected the line that they were still entitled to bill us for water. So most people understand when you get a utility bill, you have like a basic service charge and then you have like a usage charge, right? So the city determined that they had the right to charge us for like, I think it was three or four service charges for former water connections in the street that were no longer connected, right? And we literally ended up losing the case
Mm,
because they said that because it's there and you own property here, you are therefore being charged for it. So you have a lot of that going on. So when you get a letter from your city in wherever USA that says replace the sewer line or replace the water line, here's three people to call. Oh, and if you don't do it by X date, we're going to come and do it and lien your house. Right? That stuff happens because if you're unable to, drum up 20 or $30,000 is the average American, like, and you have equity in your home. Okay, you have two options. You either get a new loan and then you have the equity available, or they just lien your property and you say you just get paid when I sell the house, right? So, or the city forecloses. That happens too, and then you lose your house and you lose all that value. Um, so to kind of to answer that, it's not like there can be a really big movement around it until, in my opinion, the store of value component of somebody's home goes away, right? Because it is a concession that people are willing to make so long as they have equity value in their home. So like I said, most ways that people deal with it is either if they have the cash, they just do it, or if they're able to get equity out of their home to do it, they just do that as well. So you bring in the fiat money aspect, especially with the US real estate market, where you can just get a new loan, right? And it's basically set forever, like the price doesn't change. We're the only country that has the power to do that because it's so heavily regulated and commoditized that it just is the way it is. Like if you were in Canada right now facing, the rates that they have with the adjustable rates, like that's not a fun place to be. Okay. So to get out of this, I really only think like to you have to start like what's the chart where it goes up and comes back down, like the over optimistic chart of startups or whatever.
yeah.
Like you have to think that like there can obviously be a fix through Bitcoin and sound money, right? Because this is all new and we know it's all new and it has problems. So if it has a problem, it has a solution. We can figure it out, right? We'll handle it. But then on top of that, once you get to the top of the hill of optimism of we can fix this, then you realize that, at least in my opinion, the only way to fix it is to destroy all of the store of wealth value in a home. Okay. So if you're an American, most of your wealth is in your home. how can you stomach destroying everything that you've been told that you've been working for in order to save it? Um, and Strongtown's kind of approach to this is that it's a block by block kind of triage situation, right? Where we know that the original traditional development pattern is a block by block deal. Services expand as the block expands, as it becomes more intense or dense is usually not a good word, but as the use of the land gets more intense, then the infrastructure also increases in intensity and ability. So basically, you have all of these single family homes with all of these services that probably shouldn't be there because they can't support it. The only way to pay for it is to take out debt against your home in order to pay for the replacements. And then if there is no debt, if there's no equity to pull out and there's no debt to finance it, now you are in a pickle because there's nowhere to get money unless you have the cash. So, in my opinion, unless there are, basically jurisdiction by jurisdiction starts to figure out how they're going to handle it over the long term, you're not really going to have much success. So what you end up with is on the edges of town homes that are so cheap because either the liens, basically the special assessments that are outstanding from the city are known because it's in their plan. Usually a city has to produce an X-year plan. In Arizona, it's like a 10-year plan. So if you know that this stuff is coming down the pipe, you can get out of your house now, and then the value of the home decreases over time because they know that like there's $100,000 worth of replacements coming, right? Whether that's for the water, the sewer, or the streets. Okay. So your home declines over time, and then that's when you start getting the real value of the home in order to be able to service it. So if a home goes from $500,000 to $50,000 because you have all of this work that needs to happen just in your neighborhood alone, that's when you start to realize that like, okay, this is the nature of the system as we exist in it for this home to be there. Okay. Um, Now, on the bright side, there are small cities, usually small cities because they figure out the fastest that they can't afford the stuff, who are starting to make changes and then be adopted by other cities. So one of them is eliminating the single family home zoning code to allow what is called missing middle housing. So instead of just limiting a property to one home, most likely, for example, the one that most people grow up in, and then allowing like a duplex or a triplex or anything up to like an eightplex if it fits, right? That increases the intensity of the use of the land, which allows for more intense infrastructure to exist and be able to be afforded to replace and repair. Okay. So that's starting to happen all over the place. There's lots of different movements in different states that are allowing ADUs or accessory dwelling units. It's like the fancy word for a guest house, right? So in Arizona, I think beginning of this year, cities were not allowed to stop you from building an ADU in your home on your property if you had the space to do it, right? You had to comply with some submittals and all of these other things, but they basically can't tell you no unless you're trying to build on your neighbor's pool. Um, so there's a lot of stuff like that going on. It's nibbling around the edges, around the margins of how the system exists. There's also a few people who have written I guess, legal briefs for nonprofit organizations, like legal organizations that fight Supreme Court decisions. The one I'm trying to recall, the one I'm thinking, maybe you'll be able to help me, Logan. The group that turned over Chevron represented, I believe they were shrimp boat fishermen who were required to pay the daily fee for whatever the alphabet soup agency was that was allowed to tell them when or when they couldn't fish as long as that agent was with them. Right. And it was like $700 a day or like whatever it was. And you had to do it every day in order to go fishing. So that organization took on that case basically pro bono all the way up to the Supreme Court. And that's how Chevron got overturned. So there are people writing legal briefs about basically Ambler Euclid for the same purpose of saying that either the entire case should be thrown out on civil rights grounds because it is in effect a civil rights violation because it violates, your your ability as a single family person to live somewhere that you want to live. I'm probably doing a terrible job because I read it so long ago, and I'm not a legal scholar. But then there's the other kind of side of the coin was that the original interpretation by the district court judge who wrote, the opinion that held up the private property owner's right to build what he wanted was actually still correct and proper and should be adopted. Um, so there's stuff like that's going on. That's kind of like striking at the heart of this
Yeah.
whole mess that we find ourselves in. But it only takes out one part. The other part is that we live in a fiat credit world where the administrative state can only do what it can afford to do, right? So even if it can levy taxes and do all this other stuff, eventually people won't be able to pay the taxes. Tax revenues decline. It's the old story about like when who was, I think it was Norway, that had like a top 1% wealth tax that they thought was going to make another $500 million a year. Then it ended up costing them $500 million a
Right.
year, right? So there's the unintended consequences of trying to extract wealth from your populace that it eventually backfires because the wealth may not even exist, right? So that kind of that incorporates in what I was saying about like a homeowner's equity. A homeowner's equity is an unrealized gain or an unrealized loss. So when people talk about the value of a home today, they say, well, if I have $500,000 in equity, I'll be okay. Without understanding that, like, if your neighbor across the street sells his house, instead of for $1 million, he's got to sell it for 500,000, get away. You just lost $500,000 in value because now you have to argue against all of these different processes for why that one sale now doesn't determine the value of your house, right? So it's a very, complex, it's a very complex thing or a complicated thing when you start getting into it because you don't, all of this doesn't exist in a vacuum or on an island or all of these other things. Everything has to interplay with each other in order to get here. And that's kind of like when you mentioned earlier about the administrative state basically just starting to spin out of control and get so big. You have to take that in combination with, well, the federal, I guess the ability to print money with fiat money also has spiraled out so crazy over the last 100 years. And it's like now we're here, right? So
Right.
how do you untangle this whole mess? Um,
Yeah.
and I think the overarching my overarching opinion is that you have to basically remove the store of value component from homes so that people aren't willing to fight tooth and nail for X, Y, or Z, whatever it is, to prevent their equity from falling. And then that to me, that unwinds a lot of the other problems because then a home is no different than a car, right? You buy it, you use it, it falls apart, you replace parts, and then eventually, if you don't take care of it, you got to get rid of it. Or if you take care of it for a long time, it'll last a long time. Um,
Yeah. And I guess if you're going to go that route, then the homeowners who are storing most homeowners are storing basically all of their value in their home. There has to be another vehicle. There has to be something else for them to store their value in, that is better. And I guess that's where Bitcoin comes in. I'm curious, if you think that with all of this, building all of this on credit and this mismatch that we have, of everything that you just described in terms of the services and being able to afford things, and only because it's subsidized and built on credit. Um, do you think that the, I guess, artistic component of building has been emptied out as a result because it's not real wealth that's building the infrastructure, that when infrastructure is built by real wealth, not sort of inflated or kind of illusory fiat shenanigan wealth, or I guess wealth that's really just debasement masquerading as wealth or subsidization? Do you think that the art aspect of building infrastructure, like, your background, for example, is beautiful? That, I assume that probably real wealth probably built that, not like, but does that factor in here at all, or how do you think about just like the declining level of beauty, I guess, in
yeah.
our built environment?
So I have to admit that my background is not real. I found it like the article originally, but it's since been deleted. Um, The internet isn't forever, apparently. It was a competition to design a bridge. I believe it's in Bristol, England. It says Bristol somewhere on in one of the corners, where they wanted to build a bridge across. And then this artist also incorporated, you can kind of see some of the windows and stuff. Like they incorporated a building into it so that it was basically multi-use, right? A mixed use property, we'll call it, that also had a bridge. So I've used this image as kind of like, this is how we could live, right? This is what it could be. And when it comes to the art and the architecture and the design, it's a lot of it is entwined up in the second order effects of like this, everything being tied together, right? With the administrative state at the local jurisdictional level. I mean, don't get me wrong. All of these people, when they have their local conferences, when they want to, adopt new ordinances, they see what other cities are doing so that they can control outcomes. Like 100% that exists. Then at the same time, you have all of the problems that exist with fiat credit. So if we are assuming the listeners kind of understand the basics, as you get further and further down into fiat money, you're less able to control basically what you're allowed to do. Because as a home builder, for example, I have investors, or I need to judge or value how I spend my time building your home. So if I'm building, let's say, like $1 million home, and as the builder, let's say I have to make like $100,000 out of that million in order for me to do all that work, for it to be worth my time, because of all of the difficulty that goes into building a home, let's say, like I have to be able to make $100,000. So if you want a home and I want to build it for you, your budget is really $900,000 to actually get all of the physical material and the people on site to go through all of the processes to get everything improved. Okay. So if your money loses purchasing power, if we use the same numbers, instead of 900,000, maybe now it's only 800,000. So you've lost $100,000 in purchasing power. Okay. Now, if we do this over a long period of time, your $1 million house really only has like $300,000 worth of material in it. If you're using like parity, right? If you're judging 65 with 19 or 2025 today, that's probably what you're working with. So that's when you start seeing homes go from brick and stone to basically, drywall, softwoods, and stucco, right? Because your limitations still exist at a million bucks, right? So it's maybe, instead of also like me taking $100,000, maybe I have to make like $150,000 because all of my expenses and everything else have gone up. So you start compressing what you're allowed to do given your budget constraints. Okay. So like in economics, we would call that substitution. You're substituting basically higher quality materials for lower quality materials in order to do what you need to do. Okay. So if you do that over a 60, 70-year period, you start getting into, paper thin homes. I think one of the good examples, if you remember the Texas deep freeze, what was that, like
Mm.
when was that, 21, 22?
I think so. Yeah, it feels like several years ago now. Yeah, so probably 21, 22.
Okay, so there are pictures all over the place of people's plumbing freezing. Like if they have a 2-story house, it would freeze in the ceiling of the first floor, rupture, all the drywall's coming down, all of the insulation's falling out, all of these things. And people are finding out that like their water lines aren't copper, they're PEX, which is a kind of plastic, right? And everybody's like, what the hell's going on? It's like, well, if you knew how much copper costs today to put in a house, you would never, ever, ever ask for copper again, right? So then you have a substitute. You have this plastic PEX, which is supposed to be, it's really hard plastic, right? You're not supposed to have microplastics in it, which is probably not true. But you have to be able to build the house using your limited budget, and you have to substitute literally as much as possible in order to make it work, because a construction job is not set. Things happen, changes happen. One of the ways to understand how it works is that just because there's a line on a plan doesn't mean it actually goes there. So I can't tell you, it's called a plan bust. I can't tell you how many times, every job has a plan bust where, you draw something in 2 dimensions on a piece of paper, and then you get out in 3 dimensions and you're like, well, this is physically impossible to do this. Right. So then you have to spend maybe $10,000, $20,000, maybe it's only a couple $1,000 in order to fix what's going on. Right. And it's not like, you're blaming the engineer or the architect. Like these things just happen. Like it's really hard to build stuff in 2 dimensions, especially when it comes to a home, and then not expect problems. There are 3 dimensional, plan like Revit and all these other things that help you on commercial jobs, which eliminate a lot of this. But when you're dealing with a home, like you can't afford to pay for a service like that because it doesn't make sense to pay for it. Right. So when it comes to the art and architecture, you have the same problem. So you're not building the Empire State Building anymore with the beautiful eagles all the way up at the top, or cornices, or, all of these different things, because you can't afford to do it. Right. So if you have a building like the Empire State Building, let's just say that there's 1,000 windows. Okay. And you have all of the accoutrement that goes around it, all of the design, all of the things that you would normally see that goes around it. Well, guess what? That all goes away. We're doing flat surface with really nothing around it, right? You get your typical slant on the bottom part of the sill if it's block, or you get concrete, or like you literally just shave the block if they'll let you do it, so that the water runs away from the window. But all of those design elements that would make something beautiful that people like to see are now gone. And why is that? It's like, well, because I have to reallocate the funds for that just to be able to build the building, right? So even today, like there's some aspects of buildings that are like nice and pretty. Maybe it's like the lobby is where they spend some money. But generally, you can't compete with buildings 100 plus years ago because you literally can't afford to do it. Now you can spend all that money, but then that gets into the question of, okay, well, if you're spending the money, whose money are you spending? Are you spending the bank's money? Is it part of the loan? Or are you spending your own equity in order to do it? So a lot of times when you see beautiful buildings, I would probably say it happens more often in like commercial spaces, where if you have like an outdoor mall or something like that, like they will spend the money to make it look prettier because they're trying to recreate like a Main Street effect. And that's just like part and parcel of what they're doing. So like, they're just going to do it because they have to. That's part of how they survive. But if you're building a single family subdivision for starter homes, like no way. All of
Yeah.
the things that you think are architectural elements, were made, in the driveway and then literally just nailed to the house. If they were nailed to the house, a lot of times they're made of stucco, and then they're just painted a different color. Right. So then it's even cheaper because, well, I didn't even have to pay the labor to come out and put the wood. All I had to do was pay the labor to put, the 1x2 square that would be a shutter. And then he just tacks it onto um, the existing lath that's there. And then they just stucco over, and the painter is already there when he paints the house. So he just paints it a different color. So you start getting into like the substitutions that are required in order to afford to do something, because your purchasing power just gets absolutely demolished as the longer the fiat credit stuff goes along. And in my opinion, we've actually reached a point where like there are no further diminishing returns, because how do you make the lath shutter that you just attach on cheaper?
Right.
It's like, well,
It's end of
other
the
than
line.
moving
Yeah.
the material, then you don't have a shutter at all. So
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, I
it's
guess for the audience, I guess yeah, if you didn't hate fiat enough
yeah,
already, I think we're hopefully like ratcheting it up to a level 11.
yes.
That is again, I could say this about a lot of what you said, sort of terrifying but fascinating at the same time, illuminating all around. I have two more questions for you,
Sure.
Kelly. One is, listening to all this, I'm curious, are you aware of any country that is doing, maybe any other country, or maybe even a jurisdiction within the United States? But I'm curious if you're aware of any other countries who you do think actually have pretty good systems in place for all this, or is this a truly a global problem where everybody is kind of run up against this because everybody's in debt, or are there some like unique spots that have kind of figured out something?
I there's the Free Private Cities group kind of has an idea and grip of what they're doing. They use a lot of like standard building codes. And for me, it's like kind of a more of like a private real estate development than it is like trying to build a city, in my opinion,
Yeah.
at least from what I've seen. But I guess the easiest way to think about it is that the further you get away from a more powerful level of jurisdiction, excuse me, the further you get away from like New York City, for example, right? There are fewer and fewer rules. So like if you're in a county and it doesn't have basically can't afford to do the same level of regulation as, we'll just say New York City, even though let's say Phoenix, Arizona, smaller version. If you don't if they don't have the power to regulate that, then you have more power as an individual to do what you want, right? So I've seen, you see beautiful homes like mountain homes that are near, not necessarily near a major city, or farms or all of these other things. Like they can do more because they don't have all of the same limitations that, a city would impose on the construction of the design, right? So a lot of times counties, like at least in Arizona, counties don't regulate any part of the visual design because it's just not a process that they do, right? They probably can't afford it. Who's going to be able to do it? Like they don't have the wealth to do it. Now, if we're in Phoenix, like they absolutely are going to run you through the ringer, like on all of the ways that your building looks, you know, the old neighborhood character argument, which is nobody knows what it means. Everybody knows what they want it to mean. And that's how they get you to do what they want, right? I can't tell you how many times I've been told like it doesn't match the neighborhood character when it literally looks like the building next door, right? It's just different colors.
Yeah.
And I built the building next door. So like that literally happened to me I did two different apartment communities that were across each other. And they're like, well, this doesn't fit the neighborhood character. And I was like, I literally built the project next door. They go, well, we disagree that it's part of the neighborhood character. It's like, okay.
Yeah, I don't even. Yeah, how do you even respond to that? I don't.
You don't
That's
respond.
like an
You change.
absurd scenario.
Yes, it's
Um,
very absurd. You change your design. So that's the stuff that kind of goes into it. The hmm, the further that you get away from a source of power, the better off you are. But at the same time, you're also limited by the infrastructure that you have. So there's always people arguing that like you can do all of this in a county. It's like technically you can, but the problem with being in a county is that you're not in a city, therefore there's not enough people to either support or do all the things that you want to do. Like if it's for yourself, congratulations. Knock your heart out. Build the most beautiful thing that you can afford. Great for you. I'm happy for you. But like for the rest of us here in reality, like not everybody can just live on an island in the county because cities are composed of people. It's an ecological system that is typically a positive feedback loop unless it's interrupted. So we live in interrupted feedback loops with fiat money and the administrative entanglement that allows them to basically destroy wealth. Um, so yeah, as far as further outside, I'm not too sure. It's very much a ubiquitous kind of,
mhm.
yeah, especially in cities. So like any major city across the planet, you're going to have some form or variation of this, whether or not it's, China, where they tell you exactly, what you can build, and then you're allowed some freedom in design as long as it meets, the CCP's needs for whatever. Like they do that stuff all the time. But then if you're in the middle of nowhere, in Africa somewhere, like nobody's gonna come and tell you that like you can't build your building that way. Like, but at the same time, like there's not a whole lot of activity going on where you need to be able to support what you're doing. So if it's just for you, then it's fine. But if you're trying to be in a city or something like that, you're gonna have a really hard time.
Yeah.
But since we're not doomers. Things are changing. The small arguments are being made, and they're more successful than they used to be 10 years ago. So a lot of the work that has happened either from a strong towns perspective or for some of the legal perspectives, basically figuring out that like, hey, actually none of this is right and none of it works from different angles is starting to take place. So hopefully we don't go through the doom where everybody's value has to be destroyed in their home before they can transfer it to a better store of value named Bitcoin. But, um, you know,
Yeah. Yeah, we are
that
definitely
would be
not
the ideal
doomers. We don't want to be doomers. So
scenario.
I appreciate the hopeful note there. And I guess my last question, Kelly, and it's kind of a little bit selfish because I personally I want to learn more about this stuff. I would encourage listeners to also try to learn more about it so that more people can be aware of these problems so they can start to inform others and educate others, go to your local meetings or whatnot, try to move some change and change some policy in the right direction. But so for folks like me who want to learn more, I know I'm just looking for some book recommendations. I know you mentioned the Strong Towns book, and in your Substack you have some recommendations in there as well, but what would you recommend to the audience, a couple of books that, if they're interested in this rabbit hole of of how we got into this built environment now, and how it could possibly be changed, what would you recommend that they check out?
So definitely strong towns. There's another book called Cognitive Architecture, which goes into a lot of the evolutionary kind of stuff that I've mentioned about how humans behave in certain environments. Um, one of the authors, her name's Ann Sussman, the other is Justin Hollander. They've both written multiple books. I recommend all of them. They're very academic focused, and because they're academics, the books are a little bit more expensive, but you should be able to get the digital copies for relatively cheap. Um, and then basically classics like the On Architecture Vitruvius, and gosh, you asked me, and of course I start stumbling. I have so many books of them. Timeless Way of Building, Christopher Alexander. All of his books are fantastic. They're more of like an intuitive version. He wrote those books like 60 years ago. They're a lot more intuitive before a lot of the evolutionary kind of sciences started looking into a lot of this stuff. Um, and gosh,
Pretty good list. I think I'll probably get the audience started. I would also just suggest the audience, if you guys want more recommendations, you should just go subscribe to Kelly's Substack. That'll also
sure,
put more peer pressure on Kelly to publish more
yeah,
soon.
I should.
Um, but yeah, I think it dovetails all this stuff. I think dovetails really nicely with some of the other stuff I like to talk about. Which is art generally. Literature, writing. Visual art, all that stuff. We need to build beautiful things. And so you got to live in like a real world based on real wealth and just not a sort of fantasy land to be able to do that.
Yeah,
And so I think this is a forgotten, under discussed, piece of that culture building that I hope that Bitcoin enables, that I want there to be more of. So I want to see a lot more folks kind of going down this rabbit hole. So Kelly, I really appreciate you coming on. I could probably talk to you for 4 hours about this stuff, and we probably will have to schedule another one so that we can. But I appreciate you coming on and illuminating all of this for us, and giving us a little bit of hope at the end that we can try to solve this problem with Bitcoin and build beautiful things again. But it's gonna take some work.
yes. Well, thank you for having me, Logan. I appreciate you reaching out. I'm happy to be here, and there's always a way to solve a problem. So it may look difficult now, but there's always a way. So we'll figure it out.
All right, and so thank you again for the listeners. Thank you for being listeners, and we will see you next time. Bye.